fateful day on the Pecos River, April 25, 1875. On a sweltering day in late April 1875, the winds of destiny were blowing across the Pecos River in Eagle Pass, Texas. Private Pompey, Factor, drenched in sweat, wiped his brow as he surveyed the unfolding scene of chaos and impending death, the rugged landscape before him. Once a serene expanse of Texas plains was now overshadowed by the terrifying presence of Comanche warriors who had mounted a relentless assault on Factor and his fellow soldiers. The Comanches, notorious for their relentless tactics, had one goal in mind: the annihilation of Pompey, Factor, and his 3 comrades. To them, this wasn't just a fight. It was an opportunity for revenge, a chance to exact the torturous penalties they had become infamous for. These warriors were not only bent on killing, but aimed to deliver a cruel end to their captives, a fate far worse than death. For Pompey and his men, the situation was grim. Defeat seemed inevitable, yet their spirit would not yield. Factor Sergeant John Barnes and Trumpeter Isaac Payne were no strangers to the horrors of war. As part of a black and Seminole contingent of scouts embedded within the ranks of the Buffalo Soldiers, they had been trained and battle-tested throughout the brutal Red River War. The Comanches were not the only tribe they'd battled, but their relentless pursuit of the warriors' traditional lands and their hatred for the United States government made them a formidable force. Despite the men's varied racial backgrounds, Pompey Factor's black heritage, Sergeant Barnes' Seminole roots, and Isaac Payne's mixed ancestry, the bond of comradeship forged in battle was stronger than any racial or cultural differences. The 4 men were united by one single undeniable fact: survival. As the Comanche warriors galloped closer, each soldier knew they had but moments to decide their fate. The outcome of the battle would depend on their resourcefulness, their courage, and their ability to remain unbroken in the face of insurmountable odds. The legacy of the Buffalo Soldiers. The history of the Buffalo Soldiers is one marked by extraordinary valor, resilience, and determination. The term Buffalo Soldier itself has roots in a controversial and contentious history. One widely accepted explanation of the name refers to the soldier's hair, which was similar to the thick fur of the buffalo. This image of the soldiers, clad in their dark blue uniforms and with hair that mimicked the buffalo's mane, struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. But there's another, lesser-known reason for the nickname, which lies in the supplies the soldiers were issued. In 1866, the Army, facing severe shortages of woolen coats for the coming winter, provided the newly formed black regiments with buffalo hide coats. These heavy, full-length coats were effective in warding off the brutal chill of the open plains during winter, and soldiers, often seen for the first time by native warriors, would be clad in these thick hides. The contrasting image of the black soldiers dressed in these coats added another layer to the formidable reputation of the Buffalo Soldiers. These men, many of whom had been slaves prior to the Civil War, saw their military service as a chance for recognition, respect, and the opportunity to prove their worth in a country that had not yet fully embraced them as equals. But the soldiers weren't just fighting for recognition. They were fighting to survive in a land that was rife with conflict. In a post-Civil War United States where racial tensions ran high and the wounds of slavery were still fresh, the Buffalo Soldiers faced prejudice and hostility even from their fellow soldiers. They were often assigned to the most dangerous and undesirable posts, including the frontier outposts and the unforgiving landscape of the Western Territories. Yet they excelled. They were the backbone of many military campaigns against Native American tribes, most notably during the Indian Wars, which spanned from the late 19th century into the early 20th century. But not all the men serving under the banner of the Buffalo Soldiers came from similar backgrounds. In fact, some had a unique connection to the native tribes they fought against. The Seminole Negro Scouts were one such group. These were men like Pompey Factor, born to escaped slaves and native mothers, who had found their way to the U.S. Army of Scouts. The Seminoles themselves had long resisted the forced relocation policies of the United States government. Theirs was a proud and defiant heritage, forged in the struggle for their lands and way of life. The Seminole Negro Scouts, a unique heritage. The Seminole Negro Scouts were a distinctive and elite group of soldiers with a complex and varied heritage. They were descendants of runaway slaves who had sought refuge with the Seminole people in the early 19th century. The relationship between the Seminoles and these escaped slaves was not merely one of alliance, but of shared history. While the Seminole people had been slaveholders in their own right, they had also been fierce opponents of Southern slaveholders and often fought to protect runaway slaves seeking sanctuary. This complicated history had deepened in the wake of the Trail of Tears, the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from the southeast to Indian Territory. In present-day Oklahoma, the Seminoles were no exception to this tragedy. But unlike many other tribes, they continued to resist relocation. They fought fiercely against the U.S. Army during the Seminole Wars, and their resistance would go down in history as one of the most formidable among Native American tribes. After the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, many black and mixed-race Seminoles found themselves in a precarious position. They were no longer slaves, but they were still not fully embraced by society. Tensions in Oklahoma and the constant threat of raids from neighboring tribes like the Kiowa and Comanche made life increasingly difficult for these Seminole descendants. And so, many of them decided to migrate to northern Mexico, seeking refuge from both the U.S. government and hostile Native American tribes. The Mexican government, for its part, was eager to gain the support of these formidable warriors, as Mexico itself was embroiled in border skirmishes with the Comanche, Kiowa, and Apache. They saw the mixed-race Seminole as a valuable asset in defending their territory. The migrants from the southeastern United States, many of whom were already seasoned fighters, settled in the rugged borderlands of northern Mexico. Over the years, these men and women adapted to their new environment, often facing raids from the very tribes they had once fought alongside or fought against in the United States. It was here, in this harsh environment, that Pompey Factor was born. Factor's lineage was a mix of African and Native American bloodlines, and this unique heritage shaped his perspective on life and war. Born in 1849, Factor's early life was marked by strife and hardship, with his family's roots in the Biloxi tribe and his father an escaped slave. His family, like many others, sought refuge in Mexico, where they could escape the brutal system of slavery that had defined their existence in the southern United States. Factor's background made him an exceptional scout. Raised among the indigenous peoples of Mexico, he was trained in the traditional methods of survival and warfare. He was well versed in the customs of his Seminole ancestors, able to track animals across difficult terrain and adapt to the most hostile environments. But it was his determination to fight for his people, to defend not just his life, but his heritage, that set him apart as a soldier. The battle, a desperate stand, when the Comanche raiders attacked the scouts on the Pecos River. It was not just a skirmish. It was a battle for survival, a moment that would define the legacies of all involved. Lieutenant John Latham Bullis, a white officer who had gained the respect of his men through his bravery and understanding, was the commander of this unit. Unlike many other officers in the U.S., Army, Bullis had a strong rapport with his men, treating them not as subordinates, but as family. His leadership style was unorthodox, yet it proved effective in a time and place where the line between life and death was often drawn by the strength of one's bonds with their comrades. The scouts Pompey Factor, John Barnes, and Isaac Payne had been pursuing a group of Comanche warriors across the Texas plains for several days. They had finally cornered the raiding party on the banks of the Pecos River, but their success came at a steep cost. The Comanche, realizing they were under attack, fought back with all the ferocity they had honed in their decades of battle with the U.S. Army. Armed with .45 caliber Sharps carbines and revolvers, the scouts fought back with remarkable precision, firing at the Comanche from a distance and taking down several of the warriors. For 45 minutes the scouts held their ground, keeping up a steady barrage of fire. The Comanche, accustomed to mounted warfare and faster-moving tactics, soon realized that they were not facing a typical enemy. The scouts were skilled marksmen, and their resistance was much stronger than the Comanche had anticipated. However, as the battle raged on, the scouts were soon outnumbered and outgunned. The Comanche mounted a counteroffensive, charging at the soldiers and forcing them to retreat to a small cluster of rocks for cover. It was at this critical moment that Sergeant Barnes' rifle was shattered in the battle. In an instant, he was left defenseless and vulnerable. The situation grew more desperate by the second. Lieutenant Bullis, already wounded from an earlier skirmish, could not mount his horse, as it had been spooked during the fight. With the soldiers' ammunition running low and no escape route in sight, Pompey, Factor Barnes, and Payne made the heroic decision to stay and protect their officer.